assure you that I'm not the local preacher, as probably most of you know, and hopefully Harry's feeling better. He told me he was. So maybe I was kind of hoping he'd get up here this morning, but hopefully I'll suffer through it, and y'all will too. And hopefully we can learn some things from our lesson this morning. I'd like to thank the elders for the opportunity to preach this morning, and I always enjoy getting up here and preaching and public speaking, so hopefully I'll do a good job for you. Examples of men and women as recorded in the Bible can provide us valuable lessons. From Abraham, we can learn the value of faith in God. From Joseph, we can see the workings of God's providential care. And from Job, we can learn the importance of patience and faith under trial. This morning, I'd like to look at a lesson. Our lesson this morning will be looking at Lot and valuable lessons that we can learn from his experiences and some of the things that he went through. We can learn from Lot the art of decision-making and the importance of making proper choices. First, let's take an introductory look at the life of Lot and then focus on the decisions that he made and how it affected his life. And hopefully we can glean from that some decisions that we're going to make and have to make someday or have made, and look at how they affect our lives. In the book of Genesis, Lot is introduced to us as the nephew of Abraham. And I think a lot of the stuff we're going to be covering this morning is not new, but hopefully it'll be a good review. So in Genesis chapter 12, verse 5, it reads, "Then Abraham took Sarah his wife and Lot his brother's son and all their possessions that they had gathered and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan." So from this verse, we find that Lot was the nephew of Abraham, and that he was with basically someone that went with Abraham pretty much up to the time where he went somewhere had to leave. We also find that Lot was a man quite wealthy. We find that in Genesis chapter 13, 1 through 5, where it reads, "Then Abraham went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot went with him to the south. Abraham was very rich in livestock, silver, and gold, and he went on his journey from the south as far as Bethel to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there at first. And there Abraham called on the name of the Lord, and Lot also went with Abraham, and he had flocks and herds also." So we find here that Lot was very wealthy, and we can find later in the next verse, chapter 13, verses 6 through 9, that their combined wealth caused a problem. So let's read Genesis 13, verses 6 through 9. "Now the land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abraham's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The Canaanites and the Perizzites, I'm sure I butchered that, then dwelt in the land. So Abraham said to Lot, 'Let there be no strife between you and me, between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you will take the left, then I will go to the right. Or if you will go to the right, then I will go to the left.'" So we find here in this verse that there was so much livestock between Lot and Abraham that something had to be done. There was not enough to sustain both their herds. So we find out that Lot here was given the opportunity to choose where he would go. Abraham didn't choose for him. He had the opportunity to choose where he would go. And Lot made the choice on the surface that he thought was a good choice. he picked the land that looked like it was good for grazing, and it was a good choice for him, but we find out later that it wasn't such a good choice. So we find out here in Genesis 13, 10 through 12, he lifted his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, and it was well watered everywhere before the Lord, destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go up toward Zoar. Then Lot chose for himself in the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they departed from each other. And Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. So we find here that the plains of Jordan, which Lot had chosen, looked good from a distance, but they were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. Not knowing if Lot had known that ahead of time, but he sure found out as he journeyed toward Sodom of what it was like. We find that it was well watered and green for grazing livestock, which solved the problem of the two herds that they had. But some days we look at the same thing. We look on the surface and everything looks good. But when we do a little bit of digging, things don't look quite as good as they did on the surface. So we need to think about the choices that we make when we look into at where we're going to do, what things we're going to do, and figure out what's going to happen. As good as it may have seemed, it resulted in much heartache and sorrow and hardship for Lot and his family. It was a choice that would affect the rest of his life. As a result of his choice, Lot suffered kidnapping, and we find that in Genesis 14, 11, and 12. Then they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. So a little bit introductory to this verse is that the kings of the land came together, and Sodom was with them, but they fled. And when they had fled, they went back, the kings of the land went back and had took all the things from Sodom and Gomorrah, and they also took Lot with them when they did that. But good news is, as we know, Abraham went and pretty much rescued Lot from where he was, and he returned his goods, and he also went back to Sodom. So we find also that he suffered oppression and torment by the citizens of Sodom. We can find this in 2 Peter 2, verses 7 and 8. And he delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked. For that righteous man dwelling among them tormented his soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. So what we find here is a little bit of a description of what it was like in Sodom. Is that it was described as their sin was very grave. We find that in Genesis chapter 18, verse 20. And we find also that during Lot's stay in Sodom, he was oppressed by seeing the lawless deeds that they had done. So what do you think that Lot thought about the decision he made when he decided to choose which way he was going to go, whether he was going to do the plains or the other? I think at this point he was probably trying to rethink that decision and figure out what he really should have done. We also find out that he lost all of his material wealth. And we find that in Genesis 19, 14 through 16. So Lot went out and spoke to his son-in-laws who had married his daughters and said, "Get up, get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy this city." But to his son-in-laws he seemed to be joking. Then, when the morning dawned, the angels urged Lot to hurry, and saying, "Arise, take your wife and your two daughters, who are here, lest you be consumed in the punishment of the city. And while he lingered, the men took hold of his wife and his wife's hand, and the hands of his 2 daughters, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought them out and set them outside the city. So we find out that as a result of this, that when Lot fled, he fled with only the things on his back. And he lost everything that he had and all the great wealth that he had accumulated. Another thing that he lost was he had other daughters that had married the men of Sodom. And he had lost them because they were carried away with the wicked deeds of Sodom. So they were lost in the destruction of Sodom. We also find here that Lot suffered the death of his wife. In Genesis 19, verses 17 and 26, it reads, "So it came to pass when they had brought them outside that he said, 'Escape for your life. Do not look behind or stay anywhere in the plain except escape to the mountains, lest you be destroyed.' But his wife looked back behind him, and she became a pillar of salt." You know, I've also always wondered, why did she look back? Why did Lot's wife look back? Well, I had a couple thoughts on that. In that, was it because of the wealth that they had lost? Or was it because of the daughters that they had who had married the men of Sodom and were lost? Or was it another reason? But the only thing we do know for sure, though, is that she turned into a pillar of salt as a result of disobeying God, or the men that had come to take them out. We also find that he suffered the shame of incest of his daughters. And he went up, so in Genesis 19:30 through 36, it says, "And Lot went up out of Zoar and dwelt in the mountains, and his 2 daughters were with him, for he was afraid to dwell in Zoar. And he and his 2 daughters dwelt in a cave. And now the firstborn said to the younger, 'Our father is old, and there is no man on earth to come in to us, as is a custom of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will not lift him, and that we may preserve the lineage of our fathers.' So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with their father, and he did not know when she lay down and when she arose. And it happened on the next day that the firstborn said to the younger, 'Indeed, I lay with my father last night. Let us make him drink wine tonight also, and go in and lie with him, that we may preserve the lineage of our father.' Then they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose, lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down and when she arose. Thus both daughters of Lot were with child by their father." So we find here that both the daughters who came out of Sodom with Lot lay with him and with their father, and they had children as a result. So what can we learn from the example of Lot? It should impress us with the importance of making the proper choices in our lives. In view of what happened, let's consider a couple things, and that would be some of the choices we make that greatly affect our lives, some suggestions on how to make right decisions, and what to do when we realize the decisions that we made are the wrong ones. So let's look at the first one, and that is the choice to follow Jesus. Obviously, we know that that choice is probably the most important choice we're going to make, and it'll affect our lives more than any other. It will determine the place of our place in eternity. It will have a bearing on every other choice we make, for as a follower of Christ, you will be concerned with doing his will and not your own. Also, we have a choice, some of us have a choice of a career that we're going to follow. The choice we make will have a long-lasting effect upon our marriage, our families, and our service to God. And some things to consider of the careers that we choose, the careers that we have, is, will the career you choose cause you to make a choice between God or the job? Will the career you choose cause you to need to decide between God or working late and missing services, or taking time away from your family? Or another thing is, will your career cause you to travel away from home and away from your family often? I've experienced some of those things in my life, and I know those were not very things. When I look back, those were not very good things that happened. I literally spent a year almost away from my whole family off and on, and it was not a very good experience for all of us. We could also find the choice of our mate. This decision we make will greatly determine the extent of our degree of happiness in this life and affect our service to God. We can learn from Solomon in 1 Kings 11, verses 1 through 4. But Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonites, and Hittites, from the nations of whom the Lord said to the children of Israel, you shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they turn away your hearts after other gods. And Solomon clung to these in love, and then he had 700 wives, princesses, and 200 concubines. And his wives turned away his heart from God. So it was, when Solomon was old, that his wife turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. So we find here that we know that God told the Israelites not to marry with the nations round about them. But Solomon didn't obey God. He married the wives from among the nations around about him. And that was a serious mistake on his part, because we find out that as a result, that caused Solomon to turn and disobey God and cling to them. So, and his wives were after other gods. So that caused him to turn away. Also, we find in Proverbs 31, 10 and 11, who can find a virtuous wife, for her worth is far above rubies, and the heart of her husband safely trusts her, so he will have no lack of gain. Men and women, we should look for a godly person who has their mind set on serving God as a spouse. If one does not look for a godly person for a spouse and finds a worldly person who sets their sights on things of the world, it can make our life a lot more difficult and miserable. Also, we need to consider the friends that we have. We know that having close friends can be a wonderful blessing. We can learn that from Proverbs 17, verse 17. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. We can also look at Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 9 through 12, and learn the value of a friend. It reads, there are two better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion, but woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him. Again, the two lie down together, they will keep warm. How can one be warm alone? But though one may be overpowered by another, two can withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. So we find from this verse that a friend will be there in a time of need to pick us up. But we have to be careful that that we pick the right friends and not the wrong friends, because they can be a curse to us for us in the long run. Then we can look at the example of Rehoboam for that. And we find here in verses 6 through 14, and I'm not going to read all that, but I planned to read it, but I think I'm going to run out of time. And we find here that we know the story of Rehoboam, that he rejected the advice of which the elders had given him, and consulted the young man who had grown up with him and who stood before him. We can find that in verse 8. And then also we can look down and look at, then the king answered the people when he came back to talk to the people. Then the king answered the people roughly and rejected the advice which the elders had given him. And he spoke to them according to the advice of the young men, saying, my father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father chastened you with whips, but I will chasten you with scourges. So we find here that Rehoboam valued the advice of his peers over those of the elders, the more experienced men. The advice of the younger friends was not filled with wisdom, as the advice of the elders were. But it was what Rehoboam wanted to hear, probably. He valued, and what happened as a result is that the people rejected Rehoboam as king, and some went and served Jeroboam as king, causing the northern tribe to go eventually into idolatry. We could also look at what happens with evil companionship or evil company in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 33, when it says, do not be deceived, evil company corrupts good habits. We need to have friends who are not evil company, but share a common set of values. We also need to consider the choice of where we're going to live. And this is one that goes right back to Lot that we can look at. It was a choice, it was in this choice that Lot made his mistake. It might be just that there are some days, modern day Sodom and Gomorrahs out there, kind of like almost we're living in right now, it seems like, that we're going to experience and we're going to have to sort through. The choice can greatly affect our lives. We must be careful not to surround ourselves with evil, for evil can eventually corrupt us and wear us down. We can learn the message from Lot that he was tormented in Sodom and Gomorrah and oppressed by the evil that he was subjected to. We can look at the surface and things look good, but underneath, evil can wear us down. And another thing we can make, now how can we more likely make the right choices? How do we go about making, we looked at some of the choices that we need to make. How can we make the right choices? Well, the one thing we can do is we can ask God for wisdom. We can find this in the book of James, chapter 1, verses 5 through 8, where it says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting, for he who doubts is like a wave of the sea driven and tossed by the wind. For let not that man suppose he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. So we need to ask God for wisdom, but we need to ask him knowing that we're going to receive it. We can't doubt that God's going to give us the wisdom that we need. Another thing we can look at is seeking advice from others. Now, we can learn from the example of Rehoboam that sometimes that's good and sometimes that's not so good. But we can look at, in Proverbs chapter 11, verse 14, it says, where there is no counsel, the people fall, but in the multitude of counselors there is safety. And also in Proverbs 12, verse 15, it says, the way of the fool is right in his own eyes, but he who heeds counsel is wise. So we need to discuss the alternatives that we have if we need to make a choice with older and mature Christians who have the experience to be able to say, this is something that I would consider in that decision that you're going to make. Chances are they may have already been through the situation that you're in, and they've already weighed it out, and they unfortunately may have made the wrong decision and have learned something from that they can impress on you. We need to seek the advice and let them, of those who will tell us what we need to hear and not what we want to hear. And also, we can consult the wisdom found in the Bible, especially in a book like Proverbs. We can also do it in obedience to the Lord, as it talks about in Psalms 37, verses 5 through 6. It reads, commit your way to the Lord, trust also in him, and he shall bring it to pass. For he shall bring forth your righteousness as the light, and your justice as the noonday. Like Solomon, who disobeyed God and followed other wives. Not sure what that, sorry. So what should we do when we realize that our choice was wrong? Do what Lot did? Heed the word of God as he fled from Sodom and Gomorrah, and do what is right without reservation. Do what Peter did after he denied Christ. Repent, and if there is sin involved, repent if there is sin involved in the choices that are made, and resolve to serve the Lord. Do what Paul did after persecuting the church. Accept forgiveness that Jesus provides and determine to live for the Lord the rest of your life. The wrong thing to do when we make a decision that we regret is to continue in the choice because of the pride that we have of not willing to admit that we were wrong. We need to go and do what's correct, the things that we did wrong, and turn our lives around and do what's right. In conclusion, the example of Lot should teach us that making the proper decision is very important in our lives, and also warn us not to make our choices that we make lightly and look into things in depth before we make a decision. We need to remember Lot in that when we make decisions, we need to seek to make that decision based upon the will of the Lord, not based on what we think is right for us. Our destiny might rest upon that choice. That's my lesson for this morning. We're going to go ahead and I think we're going to have a prayer, and then we're going to go ahead and have classes next door at 10 o'clock. Oops, sorry.
Please pray with me. Loving Father in heaven, we thank you for this time you've given us, this time we can come and worship you and